Hello and welcome to this webinar. My name is Jeff Rathke. I'm the president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And we are extremely proud to offer this discussion today, along with our counterparts at the Brandenburg Institute for Society and Security. Our topic today is Reconnecting the Transatlantic Digital Economy, the role of trust in artificial intelligence. And while, of course, this is an issue that is on many people's minds today, it is also at the top of the US European Union agenda with the Trade and Technology Council, which was launched earlier this year and which held its first meeting in Pittsburgh in September. So we are especially pleased to have such a timely discussion. And I'm going to hand things over to Peter Rashish, who is a senior fellow and director of the geoeconomics program at AICGS, to move our discussion forward today. Thanks so much for being with us. And Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Jeff. Good morning to all of you, or good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar. We are pleased to convene this webinar with BIGS, who is the executive director. Tim Schuchtai is here with us today, and who I'm pleased to share moderator duties with for the session. This event is part of the Wunderbar Together 2021 program supported by the German Federal Foreign Office in partnership with the Goethe Institute. Today's webinar is the second of two that AICGS and BIGS are organizing this year. In June, we convened the first one on fifth generation telecommunications. We are truly delighted today to have as speakers Stephen Anderson, Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Communications and Information Policy in the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs at the US State Department, and Andreas Könen, Director General for Cyber and Information Security at the German Ministry of the Interior. As Jeff mentioned, today's focus will be an important emerging technology, artificial intelligence, and the opportunities for the US and Germany and the US and the EU more broadly to pursue common approaches to AI innovation and AI governance, and to try to agree on the values that should inform and underpin commercial, scientific, and government uses of AI. And we do think that as the Trade and Technology Council continues to meet, and that there'll be greater attention to this issue in the months ahead. Now, let me introduce our first speaker today. Stephen Anderson is the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Communications and Information Policy at the State Department. In this capacity, he leads development of international internet, data, and privacy policies and related negotiations with foreign governments. Before that, he was the director of the Office of Specialized and Technical Agencies in the State Department's Bureau for International Organization Affairs. And in that role, he was responsible for US relations with over 40 specialized UN agencies, funds, and programs, and was the lead US negotiator of the successful US effort to reform the Universal Postal Union's system for the e-commerce era. In 2017, he was the State Department Visiting Fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and he has also served in Mexico, Germany, Argentina, Italy, Iraq, Afghanistan, and several other embassies. He's the recipient of numerous State Department Superior and Meritorious Honor Awards. Before I hand it over to you, Stephen, let me just say that today's session is on the record. Stephen will give some remarks, then we'll have a very short discussion with him. Then I'll hand it over to Tim, who will then moderate the remarks of Andreas Könen, and then I'll take the floor back and open it up to your questions. And if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function on the screen. So with that, Stephen, it's over to you.
Well, great. Thank you very much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm glad to be back with Andreas on a panel again. I'm going to start my comments by observing something that I think all of us in Washington are very aware of, that we are in an era of strategic competition, and that technology is the fulcrum on which that competition is playing out every day. How we live, how we work, how we are governed, all of these have been impacted by the digitally connected world. American diplomats usually don't start out their presentations by quoting Russian leaders, But I think it was Vladimir Putin who said, whoever leads in an artificial intelligence will rule the world. Now, some governments, like Putin's, are using emerging technologies to maximize their control and authority, silence critics, deepen repression, and oppress minority groups. These governments are then exporting this approach to technology to other countries. We, as transatlantic partners and allies and like-minded democracies, must offer an alternative. That is why well-coordinated technological leadership by democratic nations has never been more crucial. The best way to uphold our shared values and ensure that technological advances are used to lift people up and not to pin them down is to make sure that the United States and like-minded partners in Europe remain the global hubs of technological innovation. Only then can we shape the global evolution of technology in a manner consistent with our values and maintain our strategic technological advantage and leadership. We must continue to advance innovation that complements our approach to human rights and fundamental freedoms, privacy, and the rule of law. I will focus today on how the US government is thinking about artificial intelligence and its uses to enable innovation more generally. But I'd like to start by focusing on the State Department's distinct role within the US government. At the United States National Security Commission on AI's Global Emerging Technology Summit held in June in Washington, Secretary Blinken stressed technology's central role in current administration, and he identified 6 pillars the Department of State will use as the foundational elements to support and promote US and allied interests. The first pillar is reducing the national security risks posed by malicious cyber activities and the use of new emerging technologies. This is the most basic thing our diplomacy must be able to do. Protect our people, protect our networks, prevent conflict, and establish standards of responsible conduct in cyberspace. If AI and other emerging technologies will be used as part of our national defense, we want the world to have a shared understanding of how we do that responsibly. The second pillar is ensuring that our leadership in the fierce strategic technology competition that is now underway not only continues, but grows and strengthens. We must preserve our competitive and comparative advantages in supply chains, information and communications technologies, including 5G and semiconductors, and our talent pipelines that support these industries. An open, interoperable, reliable, and secure internet that is led through a multi-stakeholder-led governance process is fundamental. We are defending these principles across the full spectrum of our engagement, from trade agreements to governance to hardware. We're using our diplomacy to unite governments and the private sector more firmly behind these efforts. The fourth pillar is setting technical standards and creating norms for emerging technologies. Technical standards help ensure quality, protect consumer health and safety, and facilitate global interoperability. We believe in a transparent, consensus-based, and private sector-led approach to international technical standards development. We are also working with partners to ensure technologies are developed and deployed ethically, and that they are used in ways that respect human rights. The fifth pillar is making technology, including artificial intelligence, work for democracy, what the Secretary calls democratic affirming technologies. Democracies have to work together on making new technologies trustworthy, combating disinformation, standing up for the internet freedom, and reducing the misuse of surveillance technology. We need to close the gaps in regulatory and legal frameworks so that democracies can collaborate more easily on issues like privacy, content moderation, data sharing, and on digital trade. Finally, the sixth pillar is promoting cooperation. Secretary Blinken called this the most fundamental imperative of our time. The bottom line truth, frankly, is this: the United States cannot deliver on these pillars on our own. We are building technology into nearly every part of our diplomatic engagement, tech by tech, issue by issue, bilaterally, multilaterally, always looking to assemble the right configuration of allies and partners in order to get things done. Just yesterday, Secretary Blinken delivered remarks on his plans to modernize the State Department and his intention to work with Congress to establish a new Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy and name a new special envoy for critical and emerging technology. In multilateral fora, we are working with allies and like-minded partners, just like Germany, to establish the principles and practices that will allow us to take advantage of emerging technologies responsibly while fostering innovation. Our collaboration with Germany and the European Union in multilateral fora has been useful for setting common principle and showcases multilateral diplomacy at its best. The United States and partners at the OECD champion development of the first international principles for the responsible stewardship of trustworthy AI. The OECD recommendation on AI is testament to how like-minded democracies, including the United States and Germany, can chart a path forward for the responsible use of emerging technologies in line with their values. Developed through an inclusive, multi-stakeholder and evidence-based process, the recommendation has become a cornerstone of global discussions on AI. To turn these principles into practice, the OECD has developed an AI policy observatory that provides a comprehensive database of AI policies from around the world, presents multidisciplinary evidence-based policy analysis on AI, and facilitates multi-stakeholder dialogue. The OECD has also developed a framework for comparing tools and practice to implement trustworthy AI systems. Last year, the United States and Germany became founding members of the Global Partnership on AI, or GPAI, a voluntary multi-stakeholder initiative for advancing AI in a manner consistent with democratic values and human rights. We firmly support GPAI's mission and believe it can positively contribute to global conversations around AI, especially regarding the latest scientific and technical developments on AI and their implications for building trust in AI. AI must not only be trustworthy, but we in our societies must trust it. In July, as Peter mentioned, the EU and the United States began our Trade and Technology Council discussions, focused on how we can enhance our cooperation and overcome our difference on how technology impacts our trade relations. AI was one of the topics featured in the inaugural TTC Ministerial, which released a first ever US-EU joint statement on AI. We welcome the opportunity to collaborate with the European Commission in the TTC and in other contexts on governance approaches to technology that advance innovation, take a risk-based approach, reflect our shared democratic values, and address shared global challenges. We share the EU's concerns about bias, privacy, and the misuse of technologies by authoritarian regimes. That is exactly why we released our surveillance due diligence guidance to try to help American companies prevent their products from being misused. Domestically, the United States has worked to define our approach to AI methodically and systematically. Earlier this year, the United States established the National Artificial Initiative Office in order to oversee and coordinate AI research and policymaking across government, industry, and academia. In May, the United States also launched the AI.gov website as a repository of information on AI. This site hosts AI policy documents and strategies, as well as the latest news and updates from agencies and federal advisory boards. You may also have recently seen that the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy announced a call to develop a Bill of Rights for an AI-powered world. This is based on the idea that we need a Bill of Rights to clarify the rights and freedoms that should be respected in the use of data-driven technologies. The United States leads in research and values-based AI, including the work of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, in developing AI risk management framework, which will provide an approach to better manage AI-related risks. This technical work at NIST is extremely important as we move forward to a period in which we're going to regulate or may regulate aspects of AI. Many US agencies have engaged in thoughtful reflection on how to approach AI and how to do it most effectively for the public good. In December of 2020, the White House published Executive Order 13960, or promoting the use of trustworthy artificial intelligence in the federal government. In addition, you can see how a variety of US agencies are approaching and leveraging AI by visiting the AI.gov website that I previously mentioned. Many of these elements are informed by the National AI Initiative, which seeks to accelerate AI research and application for for US economic prosperity and national security. We support efforts by the private sector, civil society, and all other relevant stakeholders to increase transparency and accountability related to the use of AI systems. The US approach to regulating uses of AI domestically has a strong focus on use case, sector-specific regulations or policies. We believe this is more effective than a one-size-fits-all approach. Now, we appreciate the EU's efforts to address uses of artificial intelligence that have been published in the EU AI Act, draft EU AI Act. It's a lot of letters to get out. We appreciate specifically that the Act seeks to avoid overregulation of low-risk AI applications. It will also be important to maintain this risk-based, innovation-friendly approach. It will be critical to ensure that companies have clear guidance they need to implement and observe the provisions of the Act appropriately, and to balance carefully the regulatory burdens between AI producers and AI users. We are eager to work with Germany and other partners as the discussions proceed. We also look forward to continuing close cooperation with Germany and other like-minded partners, both bilaterally and in multilateral fora, on promoting the responsible use of AI and other emerging technologies. Now, finally, and I appreciate I went a bit long, finally, I would like to thank the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies and the Brandenburg Institute for Society and Security, BIGS, for hosting today's event, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Stephen, thank you very much for those insights and that comprehensive view of the U.S. approach to AI. If I could just ask you a couple of follow-up questions. We're here in on the one hand, in a bilateral US-German context, but a lot of the work is also going to be done at a US EU level, but you also mentioned some other fora where the United States is engaged on issues related to AI. How do you see the sort of comparative advantage of different relationships and different fora? You know, what are the things the US can do especially well with Germany? What are the things where the EU and the Trade and Technology Council make sense, and where are there other structures where you think that there would be promising ways for the US to pursue its objectives?
Sure. I referred to the comments. It's a great question. I referred to the comments that Secretary Blinken made in the summer, and he talked about focusing on certain texts in certain contexts, certain partners and certain fora in order to achieve the objective. And I guess your question is, that's great, Stephen. What does that look like in practice? And I think that it looks like when we have like-minded partners on certain issues that have the capacity to work with us and implement certain guidelines and principles, norms and standards, we want to do that. I think off the top of my head, there's been a proliferation of fora. We have the TTC with the European Union. I'd have to say in the Indo-Pacific, the Quad, Critical and Emerging Technology Working Group, has been extremely important. Out of the summit in September, we released some overarching guidelines and principles on the use of critical and emerging technologies that I really think sets a high mark for what it is that we and like-minded democracies should try to achieve as we develop democracy-affirming regulations. But in practice, there is a role for multilateral institutions in the UN. The OECD, of course, I think, especially in artificial intelligence, the seminal work that they did there in establishing the norms and principles for trustworthy use of AI, that essentially, I think, is the sort of the standard, the mark that the rest of us in Europe and the United States are working from in order to sort of expand on the principles. GPay, as I mentioned, is trying to put that into practice in sort of real ways. For now, it only includes a certain subset of OECD members. We have to work with the European Union on a lot of these issues. The European Commission has competencies over certain of the regulatory practices. I think that it's extremely important also that while we are committed to being great partners with the European Union and the European Commission, that as a career diplomat who spent most of my career overseas, understanding what member states, what people on the ground, what the ministries in the various member states are thinking, will also be absolutely critical to us developing good policies that work for the citizens of the United States and the citizens of the European Union. So to answer your question in brief, I think we've got a great forum set up right now in the TTC for US-EU discussions. On AI, I think the OECD is fantastic. The Quad has been working out well for us in the Indo-Pacific. But I think it'll be very important that we develop country-to-country specific relations with member states so that we show in practice how it is that we go forward. And I'm going to put one more thing in there, and this is on regulation. The OECD talks about principles. But principles aren't what make, the principles aren't what make your computer plug into another computer in a physical sense. We're going to need to, in a practical sense, come up with sort of standards for artificial intelligence that ensure that the way that Europe regulates and the way that the United States regulates don't create interference with that intercooperation. And that, I think, is what the whole purpose of the TTC is about. And then there are standard developing organizations that would in practice implement that, but it'd be great if the US and Europe had a common approach. I'll stop there.
Okay, just one more question. Then pick up on what you just said about the importance of moving from principles to regulations or rules, and absolutely that's crucial. And I ask this question knowing the difficulties of predicting the future. But when you look at the Trade and Technology Council, are there either some issues where you say to yourself, wow, these look particularly promising when we want to move from principles to regulation, or are there some others where you say, these look particularly challenging, we need to pay attention to those?
I mean, I think when you have a relationship as broad and deep as the one that we have, as broad and deep as the transatlantic relationship, it's inevitable that there are going to be areas where our level of convergence is greater than in other areas. I think what the TTC really showed is that the United States and Europe share a common democratic vision for how it is that we need to approach critical and emerging technologies and the underlying trade that will happen between them. There are certainly areas where we're going to have to work harder, and that just means that there's going to be more meetings between people from Brussels and people from Washington. But I think what the TTC showed is that with good framework, great political engagement, and hard work by technical experts like the people on my team, we'll be able to really strengthen that.
Thank you. Good to hear. With that, let me now hand it over to Tim Schuchtai, who will introduce our next speaker. Tim.
Absolutely. And yeah, it's an honor to introduce Andreas Könen, who is the Director General of the Department for Cyber and Information Security at the Federal Ministry of the Interior in Germany. He had several other positions in this ministry, always around the topics of IT and cybersecurity. Prior, he was the Vice President of the German Federal Office for Information Security, the BSI, and Andreas Könen is a mathematician by training. So I think that's a very rare discipline that you find not so often in our governments. So welcome, Mr. Könen. And before we get started, let me and I will ask you for the German approach for trusted AI. Let me explain a little bit to our American audience the position in which you are at the moment, because in Germany, as you know, we had a federal election and the new Bundestag just came together, but we don't have a new government yet. So we are governed by a caretaker government, which makes it a little difficult, especially for a civil servant, to speculate about what a future government might or might not do. Those of you who are government employees understand what I'm talking about. But if you can, please explain us what the German approach for or towards trusted AI is, and what role the national government, the German government in our case, has vis-a-vis the role of the European Union, and also where do you see the importance of partnerships with allies such as the United States, and the difficulties or how we must deal with authoritarian states such as Russia and China in this respect. Mr. Könen, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Stuchtey, and thank you very much to all of you. First of all, that I can be with you and explain a little bit about what the German government does about artificial intelligence. And many thanks for shifting this meeting according to my schedule. That was very helpful, so I could in the end be here and explain a little bit of the potential AI has to all of us. And actually, that's the first and starting point, because I would like to explain a little bit what the AI ecosystem that now is growing means to all of us, and what it means to us as a Federal Ministry of the Interior in promoting this technology. Clearly, those AI applications are becoming a more and more important part of our lives, especially when it comes up to critical infrastructures. What you see is that, for example, traffic and autonomous traffic is an example where you see that you need AI to make it work on one hand, but on the other hand, it makes finally traffic and critical infrastructure something that we don't see so far. If you look into our regulation, you don't see traffic as a critical instance, but exactly by using AI, it will become a critical infrastructure. So actually, we see a real big potential in AI in many fields. And we see it also for public administration. And so it's for us very important to promote innovation and competitiveness in the field of AI for Germany, the European community, and in our transatlantic relations. Looking at that, as a ministry, looking very often and in its core task on security, it's very important to promote a responsible, community-oriented and human-centered development and use of AI. So many of the regulations we are pushing forward are driven by those factors. So when it comes to our security architecture, AI will take over a very important and special role. The use of AI affects the areas of law enforcement, for example, and national security, and it is already snapping the work of police forces and intelligence services. AI can help to improve the performance and the efficiency of security authorities, and in the end, thus the safety of the citizens. It should support police work, but not replace it. No technology can replace, in the end, the expertise, the intuition, and the ability to take decisions of our police forces. And that's a very important part, if you look at AI, that it has to accomplish a perfect handshake between the goods of technology it can deliver to us on one hand, but on the other hand, not to shift the police forces somewhere where they can't interact with the technology. They have to be present, they have to be seen by the citizens that they are there and that they are using AI as a tool. So in the area of internal security, AI-based applications and products are indispensable and enable new forms of evaluation and analysis of data. For example, in complex investigation procedures, we will use and see AI in the processing of mass data, large video or image files, and there it will be of great help, for example, to fight child sexual abuse already now. And that's an important point. It's in the end inconceivable to support our police forces. It can also support authorities in terms of processes and organization. That's another topic. So if you now shift the view from law enforcement and technologies relating to police forces and intelligence services and come up to the field of cyber information technology, then you see a threefold impact of AI in those areas. Clearly, we see that AI and cybersecurity have to interact in a way that AI helps on one hand to improve cybersecurity, to make it possible to evaluate all those massive data we see in protecting our networks against attacks on one hand, but on the other hand, we see that cybersecurity is needed to make AI secure, to make it in a way secure where you can see how algorithms in AI work, that algorithms can be trusted, and those evaluation methods to make AI trusted are nearly the same you have to use for making cybersecurity procedures work and to bring cybersecurity into efficiency. On the other hand, as a third thing, we see that AI could be used by the attackers themselves. So we have to be very careful about what happens there in the criminal scene. Criminal scene is already now doing a split work. One part are the ones developing attack algorithms, the other ones supplying the infrastructures, and the third ones are the ones supplying the financial infrastructures to get the loan back from their work, for example, with ransomware attacks and similar things. And they will and can use AI to even harder attack our infrastructures. So it becomes very important to look where does our AI knowledge go? How are developments shifting towards criminal scenarios, and how can we protect against this? And that was a very important point of view Germany has taken on in discussing all the activities that are going on now to shape regulations. So in the end, we see that we share the Commission's view on artificial intelligence and AI ecosystems. We have to see how we open up the benefits of this technology to the entire European society and economy. And we have to see on the other side how we regulate AI in a way so that it can come up with all the features that protect ourselves against the not so nice aspects of AI. So that means the Commission came up with a division into 3 categories of AI. Unacceptable risk AI systems, like those that could be used for the criminal scene. High risk AI systems that could cause damage, for example, in critical infrastructures. And limited and minimal risk AI systems that could be used in everyday life scenarios without any fear concerning further risk. The draft regulation proposes different requirements for those 3 categories. What we see is that it gets very difficult if we talk about those categories with respect to law enforcement. Then we have to dive more deeply into the question how AI could be used, and extremely important, how AI could be developed and brought into the market in a way so that it, on one hand, it's available for all of us, and that it's available to the police forces and the intelligence services too, but that we have a system in place where we can always decide whether we want to use those applications for security agencies or not. That's a difficult question, and it's a hard discussion already starting at the definition of AI and at the definition of those categories mentioned. And that's actually the problem we are facing in Germany and in the discussion with the EU Commission. So on the other hand, similar to what Stephen Anson already mentioned, is that we also see that in other international gremia, AI is very important. There's a NATO AI strategy of October 2021. That means that also the NATO has to use and maintain AI at a technological edge. We are committed to collaboration and cooperation among allies on any of those matters concerning the use of AI in a responsible manner in transatlantic defense and security. NATO and allies can help accelerate these efforts by building on the existing adoption efforts of several NATO and allied bodies, and that's important. Also for the upcoming government, I'm pretty sure that there won't be a change in supporting AI features and applications for NATO. So in the end, it comes up to trusted AI. So I can follow Stephen very much. And I see that trusted AI technologies should be controlled similarly as we did with the 5G in our new IT security law 2.0. We should look very careful in what we buy abroad, and there has to be some process how AI is brought into effect in our critical infrastructures. And I think we have laid a basis for those questions in our IT security law. So thank you very much. Let me see that as a starting point for our discussion.
Thank you, Andreas. And it's good to hear that there are so many, that you and Stephen are on the same page in so many aspects, so that the transatlantic alliance here is working. Let me nevertheless ask you one more question before I give it back to Peter. You mentioned the need for innovative AI-based tools for the police force, and I'm adding also for the intelligence services, and at best, as the Ministry of the Interior, you want to procure that from an innovative domestic industry in Germany, I suppose. On the other side, if you want to have this innovative industry in Germany, there's a certain need to offer that industry a large enough market. And clearly Germany and often even the EU is not a large enough market. And so there's the question, how do you balance the need to make sure that these AI tools do not end up in the wrong hands? You did mention the use of AI by criminals, and at the same time have that innovative industry domestically in Germany or the EU.
Yeah, in my opinion, it's very similar to other technologies. We are already used to deal with those questions. For example, there are a lot of tools for lawful interception. And we have developed those tools with many European and German companies, and they are exporting those tools. Clearly, this export is under the control of the Wassenaar Agreement. So what we have to do together with the Ministry of Economics is to develop the Wassenaar Agreement even further to deal with AI applications, developments and tools, so that we can clearly state where we want to export, and so that we can give our industry some clear-cut signals at hand where they can go and market their tools and their developments without any restrictions, and where they have to behave more carefully, and where they have to restrict their efforts, and where they even can't export anyway. So I think that's a new task in Wassenaar control regime, but we are going forward to develop this very similar to law for interception tools.
Thank you, and thank you for these great different views. One from someone who comes from the State Department, the foreign policy side of things, and you coming from the domestic security side of things. So thank you for that, and both of you. And with that, I give it back to Peter.
Thank you, Tim. Let me remind the viewers that if you'd like to ask a question, you can use the Q&A function, and I'll then try to pass that on to our speakers. Let me actually pick up on what Tim just mentioned. And that's this idea of US, German, US, EU cooperation at the level of data, assuming that there's, you'll have better AI, the more data that feeds into it. To what extent should we be concerned about the challenges that we now have between the US and the EU on data transfers, for example, related to the privacy shield? Is this something that needs to be remedied first before the US and Germany and the US and the EU can really take off with their with sort of AI innovation based on large, high quality data pools?
Either you throwing that one at me, or by virtue of jumping in first, I just volunteer myself.
I see you have a pretty good catching mitt there, so.
So, I think that Andreas brought up a fundamental point, and I'd say a fundamental point in terms of transatlantic cooperation. People, depending on the analogy you like, data is the new gold, data is the new oil, whatever you like to call it, data is important. And the United States and Europe need to be able to exchange data back and forth for so many of these technologies, so much of the applications that run on top of our networks, for that to be enabled. I'm not the health expert, but there are people who have very credibly said that the certain restrictions on data transfers between the United States and Europe prevented Europe from being able to participate as constructively in during the ongoing pandemic on health issues. Health research requires that kind of data as well, in the same way that artificial intelligence is. So I'll limit myself to saying that, I'm confident that the enormity of the importance of this issue, will mean that the European Union and the United States are going to figure out the way to move forward on data transfers. I'm not from the law enforcement field. I'm a diplomat, but as a diplomat, we work with law enforcement, and then we work with, I don't want to say the other side, but other stakeholders on the variety of issues that we deal with. And one of the things that always strikes me when I deal with, when I hear law enforcement professionals from, like-minded countries like Germany speak about these issues, is the clarity with which they perceive threats and risk and countermeasures, and trying to balance all of these together in the same way that Andreas talked about, for certain kinds of collection activities. There's a massive risk-based sort of analysis that goes into when and how and where. As we look at these technologies and we continue to look at data regulation, I think that what we need to keep in mind, and this is part of what is going to be important for making it trustworthy, I shouldn't be the only person who hears what Andreas is saying. I think that it'll be incumbent upon us as governments to ensure that we communicate to our societies and other stakeholders the extent to which we are taking these kinds of risk factors into consideration for everything from artificial intelligence as we look forward to data regulation and sort of related issues. I'll stop there.
Andreas Könen, how do you see it?
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to add on this, and actually, if you look into the landscape of data usage, then it's very interesting that it's at the moment much easier to exchange data between our law enforcement agencies. For example, I know some cases out of the last 3 or 4 months where we were fighting ransomware attacks together. It's easier to exchange those data than to exchange sometimes data of our companies and industries. And so I think it's very important that we make a step forward in finding out a way for data exchange. I believe that in some part, our industry is very, very careful at the moment, and it's even more careful than necessary. Any kind of data that's not identifying persons exactly can be exchanged without any problem. That means, for example, in innovative fields like automated trafficking and things like that, it would be possible to exchange data, but companies are so unsure about what now is allowed that they even refrain from that. So there's a solution necessary to the questions concerning the US Cloud Act in the relation to our Data Privacy Act. And so I think negotiations of the EU Commission should focus on a way so that we can exchange data first in a step-by-step basis, so that we can find out which kind of categories of data could be exchanged, like we do in law enforcement, under clear-cut rules and under provisions that help our industry to get a better look into the system the other one is using, and so vice versa. So in my opinion, in the end, the very hard point is when it comes about data that's dependent on persons and their private issues, like health data. That could be very complicated to come up to a solution. As I understand, for example, the people in our house here in the Ministry of the Interior that are the ones dealing with those data protection issues, there I don't see how we could solve this easily, but nevertheless, let us start step by step, and I see then solutions will come out and develop. Thank you.
When we look at AI, of course, the need to balance different interests, commercial interests, values, security, those are all there, and that's what the US and Germany and the US and EU are going to do together. But when I look at this statement that came out of the Trade and Technology Council inaugural meeting in September, I also noticed an emphasis on equity, on making sure that the economic impacts of the use of AI, would be fair to all groups in society. So that my question is, what's a way that the US and Germany, either individually or together, or the US and the EU, what's a way that you can make sure that you're hearing what the business community has to say, but also what, say, groups, NGOs are saying in terms of their concerns about equity? How are you going to listen to those different groups and sort of take a balanced approach to, not that those interests are conflicting, but how do you take a balanced approach to these different concerns that both your governments probably have?
Yeah, perhaps I start this time, if you allow. Actually, it can't be seen clearly and exactly how our new government will position itself in this question. But clearly, what is planned here in Germany is that we set up a center that exactly deals with all those aspects of industry and the companies on one hand, that takes into account the questions non-government organizations have about AI, and all other questions that come in perhaps from research about this. So, for example, the Federal Office for Information Security will be part of this effort and will be an authority that, for example, could dive into the algorithms of AI and establish a transparent system of analyzing and putting some marks on such algorithms, and saying whether those are high-risk applications or low-risk applications. And that could be discussed in the platform that would be provided by this mentioned authority. So those, if there would be an authority in a similar way somewhere in the EU or somewhere in the US, it would be even perfect to combine the efforts and to see how we could bring together NGOs that are working internationally or nationally in one of our countries, and to see whether we could start a discussion platform that could be able to differentiate a little bit more exactly what the real questions in the end are, and where we have to get real contracts, agreements, or in the end, lawful regulation.
Stephen, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. In fact, I sort of had this question marked in my category of, what are your biggest concerns about artificial intelligence? And I think over the next few years, the issue of equity is certainly one of them. Emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, of course, they present great opportunities, but they also give us lots of reasons for concern. As I mentioned in my opening comments, when I quoted a president to the east of Germany, there are authoritarian states who want to use artificial intelligence for their authoritarian purposes. AI is going to play a transformational role in the future of the global economy, society, and culture. And we have to make sure that that transformation is for the benefit of all citizens, including those who are traditionally disadvantaged. We have to make sure that it doesn't threaten human rights, fundamental freedoms, privacy, or rule of law. The whole set of issues that Andreas was talking about that we need to balance. But that point on equity there, I think what we're also very concerned about is the potential for bias or discrimination resulting from automated decision making. The data that is being used to train the artificial intelligence systems can contain the societal biases that are inherent in what we observe when we train artificial intelligent bots on conversations in social media. They tend to pick up some prejudices based on what they see and the way conversations happen that we don't necessarily want to be coded into our decision-making systems governed by or influenced by artificial intelligence. So I think that's a key component of the future of artificial intelligence, is ensuring that we don't codify past biases through the data that's used to train the AI moving forward.
Thanks. We have a question from Jonathan Spat. He asks, with growing distrust among many Americans and our federal government, justified or not, what kind of outreach will be most effective in educating and demonstrating confidence in what the citizens are being asked to accept in terms of privacy, data sharing, and the resultant benefits of AI?
Gosh, I think there's three questions in there, very deftly disguised as one. The Secretary of State yesterday, and I'm speaking from a perspective of foreign policy, he noted how we as diplomats also need to speak more frequently to Americans about what it is that we're doing overseas. The President and the Secretary call it a foreign policy for middle class. So we have to make sure that the meetings that we engage in, the discussions that we have with our foreign partners, that we're explaining them to domestic audiences so that they understand how it is that we're working to benefit them. I think most specifically on the issues that are governed here, there has been a narrative for the last 10 years, understandably so, about how it is that the United States approaches data privacy. There are concerns with the frequency of breaches from companies, and there are specific instances of companies that many, I think, would consider were bad faith efforts at protecting the privacy of American citizens or others. We've seen some significant enforcement actions on behalf of the FTC related to these issues, and I think that what we need to separate the discussions about what it is that private companies are doing, how it is that private companies access data and how governments access data. I think those are two very distinct issues that, oddly, the approach from the United States and Europe tends to be, the concerns that citizens have are different. But we have to do a better job of explaining that. And I think we need to do a better job of explaining, especially in the United States, the incredible amount of protections that are put in place before the government accesses anyone's data. And then I think the third part, that's with artificial intelligence. The proof is in the pudding, or I think it was Milton Friedman said, the proof is in the eating of the pudding. And we have to make sure that artificial intelligence as a technology serves the interests of middle-class Americans and Europeans, that they see that it respects their rights and that it improves their lives. When that happens, I think that there will be more trust in it. Over.
If I may interfere and widen Jonathan's question a little bit, because it's not only Americans who are sometimes skeptical towards their government. Given Germany's history, I think Andreas Könen can say a few words about his strategy to make Germans trust into AI applications, especially when it comes to the use with the law enforcement agencies.
Yeah, I think it's very important, very similar to what Stephen said, that we handle the data and the algorithms with care. And it has to be clear at any time, for example, to a citizen who goes into e-government applications, that those citizens know which kind of artificial intelligence system, for example, is behind that, and which kind of databases are used to handle, for example, the request a citizen is placing into such an e-government system. That's where we have faced to the citizens of the government, and it's clear that there have to be transparent systems. Very similar. It is very similar if you go up to the law enforcement agencies. It has always to be clear when a police or force or intelligence service is acting on some data by artificial intelligence systems. For example, predictive policing. That's something that is used already today. And it has to be clear to the citizen why one area of a city or another area of a rural country is exactly marked as a hotspot, for example, concerning crime. It has to be explained how this result comes up, how this result is interpreted, and that the databases, for example, that drives such signals is actually done very carefully, and that there's not a social bias, for example, already built in the system, that depending on the fact that one or the other community is living in an area of the city already drives the fact that this comes out as a hotspot. And I come up to the same conclusion. It depends all on communicating and making transparent how AI is used by the government.
Thank you. I think we're reaching 11 o'clock or 5 o'clock in Berlin. So let me just take the opportunity to once again thank Stephen Anderson and Andreas Könen for joining us today for this webinar, and thank them for helping us for their rich contributions, which I really think have helped us to move forward the German-American and transatlantic debate on artificial intelligence, and highlighting how much of a priority it is and will continue to be for the two governments. I'd like to also thank Tim Stuckdey and Biggs for our great cooperation over the course of this year, and of course thank Wunderbar Together for allowing us to be part of their program of events in the United States this year. And finally, to thank all of you, the viewers. I think we had about 100 people who are with us today. We appreciate that you tuned in. And last thought is that we will continue to work on issues of AI. So continue to stay tuned in, please. And until then, I want to wish you a happy rest of your morning and afternoon.